okay? And the so-called Nazi bell, they never got it stabilized. Now, so it would lift up and move around. We have video footage of it. It'll be in the film, actual footage. However, they never got it stable enough to do a lot with it. So Werner von Braun, Hermann Oberth, and others who'd worked at Pinatubo and these other facilities for the Germans in World War II were brought into, instead of being executed, like many Nazis were, they were brought into our intelligence community, into our aerospace community. And some of them, unfortunately, took it over from inside. So in a sense, we're living through the Fourth Reich. We defeated World War II, was the Third Reich, Nazis, but they learned to, instead of clumsily stumbling around doing it that way, they went subterranean. So the globe today is a Fourth Reichian fascist order. Now, I say this with no pleasure, and I am not speaking hyperbole. And that is the problem. It's a very huge problem. And there are all kinds of actors and players that have glommed on to that agenda, a bizarre collection of people from different walks of life and different agendas. We'll get into this later. But the secrecy around this issue has only been partial. They have been wanting a certain acculturation around UFOs and ETs for the purpose of having the public think that it could be true, but they don't really know what it is. So right now, more than half the public, over this longitudinal, long-term psychological propaganda warfare program launched in the 50s, believe UFOs are real. They believe there's intelligent life in the universe. But that's about where the granular knowledge ends. There's not a lot of granular knowledge, detailed knowledge of what all this is. And the truth is that this area of anti-gravity, let's call it, for pop culture usage, EMGs, electromagnetogravitics, gravity control, this became the focus of the aerospace industry and actually was reported open source in aerospace journals in the late 40s and early 50s, and then it went all black. This is a documented fact. Why did it go black? Because they finally figured out how to master it, and they didn't need to have more people joining in. So they wanted to close off that discussion. So in October 1954, gravity control was mastered, and we began to build various prototypes of what the public would call UFOs. And some were made to simulate the shape, appearance, and motion of an extraterrestrial vehicle. Because what better way to confuse people than to have something that looks almost the same? Is it gold? Is it fool's gold? Is it real? Is it Memorex? Get where I'm going here? This is how the spy masters operate. And luckily for them, and unfortunately for us, with the absence of the Fourth Estate and independent science and independent oversight from the public interest, the Commonwealth, they've been able to get away with enormous deception since the 50s. So I call those the assets that are material, physical craft. Now that's one category. We'll return to this. There's another category, and this is more difficult to understand, and that is electromagnetic assets. And these include electromagnetic systems that could optically, like a very advanced hologram, simulate an event. Electromagnetic systems that have been called popularly electronic warfare systems that are psychotronic and radionic that interface with consciousness and thought. And electromagnetic systems that can affect large segments of the population when targeted. Now these began to be developed in an advanced fashion by the 40s and 50s. And by 1956, it had been accomplished to the point of state-of-the-art. So about a year after I was born. And then the other asset, the third category, is human intelligence, human assets. And these are folks who, some wittingly, some unwittingly, have been provided with a script and experiences that they honestly believe are real, but that have been programmed and are like very advanced consciousness holographic experiences. If you will, electronic hallucinations. And we'll get into this also. This gets into some issues that are going to make me very unpopular with some folks. I don't care. I mean, we don't have time for that. I don't care if you like me, love me, hate me. People got to know the truth on this. So I really don't. I'm not running for mayor of Crazy Town. I just want just want the truth out because we can't afford this childishness. Now, so those three categories in general are what we're going to focus on. First, let's talk about the air forms, let's call them, material assets, that are being made by Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, Northrop Grumman, my uncle's old company, Boeing, Phantom Works, etc. And I have many, many people who have worked in these aerospace programs, also at EG&G here. I mean, we're in Las Vegas, in the Nellis Range, so-called Area 51's up the road. It's an old facility, but we'll talk about which facilities are key. But those military and corporate contractors have always had compartmented operations dealing with this, going back to after World War II. Now, some of the material that was being done by the Nazis with the so-called Nazi bell that was anti-gravity, but it was not well controlled, and they hadn't developed it well by the end of the war. We detonated the first atomic bomb first. Began to get more and more perfected. And as I mentioned, by 1954, gravity control was attained. At that point, we had a race to see how we could, how many of these forms we could develop, and the research between the mid-40s and the mid-50s was augmented, assisted, or propelled forward by the reverse engineering and study in a separate compartment of so-called extraterrestrial materiel. I'm referring now to things that some of you have heard about, like certainly the Roswell crash, Kingman, Arizona event. There are others that have happened, and these objects, which were downed with electronic warfare systems, they didn't just fly in and crash in an electrical storm. That's a myth. You don't go through interstellar space and come into the atmosphere of Earth and oops, I can't navigate, and then just suddenly crash. And it happens to be right by the only atomic bomb squadron in the world in Roswell, New Mexico. That was the only 509th Bomber Squadron was the only place in the world at the time of that event. And the interstellar civilizations were worried about what is going on Earth, because when we detonated those bombs, it was picked up by them. And they came. And they're here. And they're worried. And they should be worried. So that's what opened up the modern era of UFO extraterrestrial activity. And this is why you need to call this what it is. There's two things here. There's, the UFO is a sort of a general phrase. It just means an unidentified flying object. Well, it's unidentified only to people who are not informed. They don't fly in any normal sense of the aerodynamics flying of a plane, but they are objects. So the only true part of the word UFO is O, and the rest is an obfuscation. So a blurring of the truth. But if you use that pop culture term of UFO, there are two types. Man-made ones here, interstellar extraterrestrial ones here. And you can tell the difference if you get up close enough, if you know what you're looking for. And we'll talk about that. The ones that were being developed by these early aerospace and research efforts were then benefited by studying the extraterrestrial objects, that we began to learn how to use electromagnetic scalar longitudinal systems. Now, I'm not going to get into a big physics discussion here except to say the light you're seeing here is in a wave like this, right? So you have a wavelength, and so you have all kinds of spectra: infrared, ultraviolet, visible spectra, different. A laser is coherent light. So a green laser is all the green, and it's coherently propagating, okay? Longitudinal or scalar electromagnetic signal is actually not a wave, but a point in a line. And it actually can propagate at multiples of the speed of light, of the waveform of light. So the waveform of light is what we call the speed of light, but there's this other type. So that began to be studied also in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, began to be weaponized into systems, and by 1947 or so, they began to have, and I use this word cautiously, successful deployments of it, so that it would hit an interstellar vehicle, interfere with its electronics, and have it crash. Now, I know men personally who have operated those systems up to and including recently, in the last few years, at facilities at various places around the globe. So when you begin to hear that, beginning from the 40s until not that long ago, there were multiple crash retrievals of these objects, it wasn't because these interstellar civilizations, who they're running around with IQs of 400 to 600, so I'm like a Down syndrome child, and but they're very advanced. They were running into the deployment of these systems, and they were based all over, and they began to be based all over the planet. And by the 1960s, they had successfully propagated those around the globe in enough locations covertly that they could track and target an extraterrestrial vehicle, hit it, and have it become disabled. Now, obviously not every ET object that appears has that happen, so it's not like it happens every nanosecond, but it has happened dozens and perhaps hundreds of times. I met with an officer in the Air Force, in the Army, who was at Fort Huachuca out here in Arizona, Army Intelligence Headquarters, who had been in an underground facility in the 70s, where there were 9 extraterrestrial vehicles and autopsied bodies that were in storage there. So, and that's just one facility, and that was 40-some years ago. Fort Huachuca. It's near Tombstone, ironically, Arizona. So these facilities began to be developed that are all underground, and they were studying the extraterrestrial material. That operation was very separate from the conventional, let's call it, extraordinary anti-gravity research going on in other operations. There are very few points of contact. So this is where you get into a complex understanding of TSSCI, Top Secret Special Compartmented Information or Intelligence. And the compartmentalization is very, very specific. And there could be people working on, say, gravity control systems for the Lockheed Skunk Works, but they weren't allowed to talk to and didn't know anything about the people studying the extraterrestrial materials, but there would be a few points of contact that would bridge it over. All right, but very few, very tightly compartmented. That's how that is structured. And I have had the privilege of interviewing people who've worked on both sides. Now, when you begin to consider then, we've had over 60 years, 62 years, and trillions of dollars in black budget unacknowledged special access funding, USAP, unacknowledged special access, completely black, funding of this kind of research and development, both on extraterrestrial material and on other conventional, and the then augmentation of the the conventional anti-gravity human with the extraterrestrial studied material, you can begin to realize that what's out there, that humans control, is fearsome and awesome. And unfortunately, to the lay person or to the average general, admiral, or president, is indistinguishable from an extraterrestrial object in their mind.